Well, it certainly has been a very challenging 2 weeks in our nation's history. My head still spins. So before I preach, I have to make a disclosure. I'm a bit OCD. I wrote this homily 4 weeks ago, okay? I wrote it 2 weeks before the debacle in Washington. And I wrote it in response to that very, very difficult gospel. And in 2 weeks before this whole thing in Washington, I went back to 1997 to one of the films that highlighted the Sundance Film Festival and won all kinds of awards, and it was entitled The Company of Men. And it's hard to imagine that the same film today could receive such accolades, because it presents us with a real picture of evil. Cold, unblinking, reptilian, as Roger Ebert at the time had said. The main characters are Chad and Howard. And Chad is dumped by his girlfriend and comes up with a scheme to seek revenge. His friend Howard has no backbone and simply goes along with Chad's scheme to find some very vulnerable woman, shower her with all kinds of love and affection, and just when she's in their trap, to dump her. You see, Chad's philosophy is that life is for the taking. And resulting from this philosophy is cold, unblinking, reptilian evil. Now, the gospel this weekend challenges that kind of evil that existed in society at Jesus' time. We hear in that painful gospel divorce connected with adultery. And this is shocking to us today in our culture. But to understand the gospel, we must understand that the same kind of evil depicted in that movie, The Company of Men, is the evil that Jesus was challenging in that gospel. You see, the social historical situation of Palestine during the time of Jesus was a society dominated by foreign overlords. Village life maintained a continued, although greatly shaken, patriarchal culture. The possibility of a husband giving a bill of divorce to his wife without any recourse on her part rests upon these patriarchal assumptions. And as divorcees, women would have been socially shamed and disadvantaged. They could not remarry, and they could not readily support themselves. So many women who were given divorces by their husbands were forced into prostitution to survive. This is what Jesus was confronting. This is the kind of evil he was confronting by calling for an egalitarian vision of marriage within the village life of his day. So this is a very tough gospel if we don't understand the context, which is so different from the context today, the evil that existed back then. And we also have to remember that Jesus was certainly no weak prophet, that when he saw injustice, he confronted it, that he was never afraid to call out the leaders of his day when they treated people badly and unfairly. This weekend is also the Right to Life weekend, and we are reminded, all of us, that in society today, there are many assaults on human dignity. In Jesus' day, women, and married women especially, had no rights whatsoever. Our society today, we have different problems with marriage. Elizabeth Landau is a 32-year-old single person who wrote an article in Scientific American that a lot of people her age, millennials, are what she calls commitment phobes. Publicly, Miss Landau supports her friends' marriages, but privately she writes, "I feel left behind in what Vanity Fair described as a dating apocalypse. Of course, plenty of single men and women like me don't seek out one-night stands, but I feel like in the dating app era, many aren't keen on investing lots of quality time in any particular match when a better one might just be a swipe away." And she continues, she says, my outlook may have entered a vicious cycle. It's hard to get excited about meeting someone who won't care that much about you. She certainly is onto something. The Pew Research Center reports that millennials are significantly less likely to be married than previous generations in their 20s. And a Gallup poll found that the percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds who say they are single and not living with a partner rose from 52% in 2004 to 64% in 2014. And marriage among 30-somethings also dropped 10 percentage points during that decade, while the percentage of living together rose from 7% to 13%. So why? Well, more than half of the millennials surveyed by Pew characterized their own cohort as self-absorbed. And a psychiatrist from San Diego University wrote, trying to live with somebody else and putting their needs first is so much more difficult when you have been raised to put yourself first. So going back to the movie, it seems that one cannot be married or in any kind of a relationship if one's philosophy is life is for the taking. The singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen once called marriage the hottest furnace of the spirit today. And he went on to say that marriage is much more difficult than solitude, much more challenging for people who want to only care about themselves and only care about their own needs. And Alain de Botton is a philosopher. Alan is his name. And he had a very intriguing article in the New York Times, a very intriguing title to the article. And his title is, Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person. And in this article, he claims that for the last 250 years, couples have been deluded by what he calls the romantic view of marriage. And the romantic view of marriage is that a perfect being exists who can meet all your needs and satisfy everything, every yearning. And when that perfect being doesn't meet all of your needs, that's when people think that they married the wrong person. Where he claims that the romantic view simply doesn't work. And he writes, we end up lonely and convinced that our marriage, with its imperfections, is not normal. And he argues for this realization, this reality in all of our lives when he says that one should approach marriage with the awareness that every human will frustrate, anger, annoy, madden, and disappoint us. And we will, without any malice, do the same to them. And the failure of our spouse, he says, to save us from our grief and melancholy is not an argument against that person, and is certainly no sign that the marriage isn't working. It takes me and reminds me of what the comedian Rita Runder says about marriage. She wrote, I love being married. It's so great to find the one special person that you want to annoy for the rest of your life. I use that often in marriage homilies. In the days of Jesus, it was a patriarchal view of marriage. Women had no rights whatsoever. Jesus confronted that. Today, I believe Jesus would confront the romantic view of marriage, that if your spouse doesn't fulfill all your needs and expectations, you think the marriage is over. Well, not so fast. When all of us begin to realize that no one can meet all our needs and our yearnings, that's only the beginning of us moving away from the philosophy that life is for the taking. Life is really for the giving.